Hi, good night. I will continue with my lecture. Goldman Envy. Goldman Sachs went public on May 4, 1999, ending a 130-year partnership and ushering in a new era, with shareholders to answer to, a board of directors to provide oversight, and a chief executive officer instead of a senior partner. Even at a time when internet IPOs were all the rage, Goldman's public offering stood out. The stock was priced at 53 a share, but it opened at 76. The opening was delayed an hour because the demand was so strong. By day's end, it it stood at 17 a share, giving it a market valuation of 33 billion. The 3.6 billion the company raised in the offering made it the second largest IPO ever. The average take for the 350 firm and current partners who owned most of Golden's stock was 63.6 million. Senior partner turned CEO John Cornish held shares that were suddenly worth 305 million. Hank Paulson, who became CEO within days of the IPO, had a stake worth 289 million. One Wall Street competitor told Businessweek to have priced this much paper as a non-technology stock is incredible. To an outsider, the Goldman IPO must have seemed like a no-brainer, but people connected to the firm knew that the act of going public had been the culmination of a long struggle that had left many scars. As early as 1986, Bob Rubin and Stevie Friedman, who were still good hits of the fixes, become department, but were already pushing hard to reshape the Goldman culture. Floyd the idea of an IPO. It got nowhere. Over the next 5 or 6 years, the subject would occasionally bubble up, sometimes in a small discussion, sometimes at firm-wide meetings, but the resistance to an IPO from the majority of the partners and former partners who retain an ownership stake in the firm even after they retire remain strong. Some fear it will destroy what made Goldman special. Some worried that they will be disadvantaged compared to other partners who had larger stakes. Some didn't want to see Goldman's financials and their compensation printed in the newspapers. In truth, however, Goldman badly needed to go public. Merrill Lynch, Lehman, and Morgan Stanley were already public companies, as were most other big Wall Street firms. Big, publicly health bank like Citibank and JP Morgan were Goldman competitors. Trans- transfer transformation deals were taking place that were reshaping Wall Street, and those deals use stock as currency. Wall Street firms that went public suddenly had what Charles Ellis, the Goldman historian, calls substantial permanent capital. They could take more risk. They could grow more rapidly. They were no longer reliant on the partners' capital. Firms that didn't go public would, in all likelihood, be left behind. When Cornice became senior partner in 1994, he made it his mission to persuade his partners about the necessity of an IPO. In this he succeeded. The deal was originally supposed to happen in the fall of 1998, but had to be postponed. Embarrassingly, when Goldman got caught up in the Russian crisis and the collapse of long-term capital management. Even when the IPO finally took place the following spring, it was not without international turmoil. Shortly before it finally went off, Cornice was housed in a palace coupe replaced by Paulson, and John Whitehead, he of the famous 14 Business Principles, wrote an anguished letter to all the Goldman partners. I don't find anyone who denies that the decision of many of the partners, particularly the younger men, was based more of the dazzling amount to be deposited in their capital accounts than on what they felt would be good for the future of Goldman Sachs. The IPO was a critical turning point for Goldman Sachs. Over time, its culture did change. As the company, you couldn't really call it a firm anymore, became focused on such measures as return on capital, stock performance, and growth. A firm, a firm where senior partner used to say trees don't grow to the sky began instead to talk about aggressive goals for return or equity. The trading side of the firm, for which substantial permanent capital was its lifeblood, eventually overwhelmed the im- eventually overwhelmed the investment banking side in terms of profits, stature, and ethos. And starting in the early 200s, 2000s, Goldman, having adhered to life as a public company and having transformed itself into a money machine, when on a run the likes of which has rarely been seen in the annals of corporate America. Its 2003 revenues were 16 billions. They rose to, to 50 billion in 2004, 60 billion in 2006, and nearly 30 billion in 2006, more than double what it had been just 3 years before. Its market cap that year topped 88 billion. Somehow, Goldman always seemed to be in a sweet spot of every market. Somehow, Goldman always seemed to react to big market shifts faster than anyone else. Somehow, Goldman never seemed to make a wrong move, but nobody could quite say how, as Goldman began generating most of its revenue from trading. It became impossible for outsiders to see how Goldman was making its money. Trading can mean a lot of things. It can mean acting as a market maker is sorry. It can mean acting as a market maker or trading for one's own account or both. It can mean treating clients fairly or rapping their face off, as traders something put it. It can mean trading plain vanilla bonds or peddling complex derivatives deals. Competitors began to whisper that Goldman had become increasingly ruthless, increasingly cutthroat, and increasingly your ear off for a nickel. No, sorry, and increasingly concerned only about its own bottom line and its bonus. Date cut your earn off for a nickel, rip your throat out for a quarter, sell their grandmother for a penny, and sell two grandmothers for 2 pennies. Groused one private equity executive. The rest of Wall Street watched Goldman metamorphosis with a mixture of envy, frustration, and resentment. But even as Goldman's peers questioned and criticized its transformation, they also tried to copy it. The, the money, but the profits the firm produced and the paychecks its partner got made Goldman the firm that anyone else had to keep up with, and to the outside world it looked like they had become like Goldman. They all embraced risk taking and they all began to produce outside profits, and yet the crisis would show that they weren't like Goldman at all. A mile or so north of Goldman's Wall Street offices, in a high-rise complex a stone's throw from ground zero, stood the headquarters of another venerable Wall Street institution, one which a name that to most Americans was far better known than Goldman Sachs. This firm was Merrill Lynch. It had been founded in 1940 by an intense, ambitious stockbroker named Charlie Merrill, whose notion of who to success on Wall Street was completely different from anyone else at the time. Merrill's idea, nay his lifelong crusade, was to sell stocks and bonds to the American middle class. For most of its history, Merrill made its money by bringing Wall Street to Main Street, a phrase its founder coined. Merrill Lynch was the thundering herd that was bullish on America. It had brokerage officers all over the country and employed at its peak some 16,000 brokers. Merrill's core brokerage division was a good, solid, profitable business. This was especially true after 1982, when the combination of a long bull market and legal change that caused people to begin investing for their own retirement turned tens of millions of middle-class Americans into investors. Merrill had a fixed income division and an investment banking division. It had equity analysts who were highly rated by institutional investors. The arbiter of such things, it had business that ranked high on the language table, and it had been an obsolete trailblazer in going public, which it did in 1971, only the second firm to do so. Yet it was never held in the same esteem as Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs. Goldman especially made so much more money, and with so many fewer people. It dealt with sexy edge found and counterparties rather than middle class Americans. By the early 2000s, there was no firm suffering from a worse case of Goldman envy than Merrill Lynch. The primary reason for this was that in 2004, Merrill Lynch elected its president, E. Stanley O'Neill, to be the new CEO. O'Neill had joined Merrill as a trader on the Jung Bond desk in 1987 when he was 35, proud, prickly, intolerant of dissent, and quick to take offense at perceived slight. O'Neill had never worked as a stockbroker and had no particular affection for the business that had long been Merrill's heart and soul. His burning ambition was to change Merrill. He wanted to transform its modern Merrill culture, which he viewed as blunt and soft, not adequate to the times. He once told a college, and he wanted to put new emphasis on trading, especially fixed income trading, where the fat profits lie. Under O'Neill, Merrill got into the business of lending money to private equity firms. It boosted its proprietary trading desk. It greatly expanded its commodities trading business, and it bulked up its mortgage desk. Most of all, O'Neill pushed Merrill to take more risks and bigger risks. Goldman Sachs like risk. After all, isn't that how one made Goldman Sachs like profits? Stan O'Neill was the king of men who could bristle even on comments that were meant as praise. So it is no surprise that he never found the label African American CEO to his liking. Yet his one his yet his was one of the great African American success stories in modern business. O'Neill was born in the tiny town of Whitby in eastern Alabama, an hour due north of Auburn. It was, says a friend, a tall town where it was dangerous for black people to look directly at white people. Well, into the 1980s, one of its prominent citizens publicly crusade against interracial marriage. O'Neill's grandfather was a slave. His father was a poor farmer who moved his family to Atlanta when Stan was 12. They lived in a housing project until his father established himself as an assembly line worker at an early General Motors plant. After high school, O'Neill was accepted into a work-study program by the General Motors Institute. GM then hired him as a shift foreman upon his graduation, and gave him a merit scholarship when he was accepted at Harvard Business School. Once O'Neill had his MBA, General Motors put him in its treasury department and gave him a series of promotions. Although he was clearly a comer at GM, O'Neill took a job at Merrill because he left that it offered him more opportunity. By 1990s, he had been put in charge of the young bond desk, where he quickly impressed the top brass with both his effectiveness and his ruleness, something he would continue to do as he made his way up the ladder. As the head of the brokerage division when the internet bubble burst, he laid off thousands of brokers without asking his then boss, CEO David Komansky, for permission. As chief financial officers in the late 1990s, he sent Komansky, an analyst of the company that was far taller and more clay-edged than the Merrill culture was accustomed to, criticizing the firm's low profit margins and concluding that the root cause of our competitive margins are both structural and cultural. Far from being put off by O'Neill, Komansky was impressed. The one thing about the stand, Komansky later told the New Yorker, was that the gets things done. By July 2001, O'Neill had been named president of Merrill Lynch. Komansky had planned to stay on as CEO for a few more years until he turned 65, but two events forced him out earlier. The first was 8/7. Several Merrill employees died in the attack, and the firm's headquarters were badly damaged. During and after the attacks, O'Neill took charge while Komansky seemed paralyzed. O'Neill filed the vacuum, recalls one former executive, concluding that Wall Street was unlikely to recover quickly after 9/11. O'Neill instituted big layoffs. Komansky cautioned him against such a move, fearing a public backlash so soon after the terrorism attacks, but O'Neill had no patience for such thinking. Secondly, too, O'Neill simply wasn't willing to wait a few more years to become CEO. He was ready now. Before being named president, he had rivals for the top job. He outmaneuvered them, and then, as president, pushed them aside. Once he became president, he cultivated key allies in the firm who had ties to board members. They began a, agitating for O'Neill to take over, arguing that the firm couldn't wait to make the change O'Neill had in mind. By the end of 2002, Komansky had turned over the reins to O'Neill, though he had hoped to stay on as board chairman. Komansky soon accessed to O'Neill's demand that he give up that role as well. Thanks to all the jockeying around O'Neill's ascension, the Merrill Lynch executive suite had become a very political place. His appointment as CEO didn't end the palace intrigue. Strangely thought the next round of intrigue came not from his many enemies in the firm, but from two of his closest allies. One was Arshad Zakaria, the head of global markets and investment banking. The other, Tom Patrick, who had been Merrill chief financial officers under Komansky and effectively O'Neill's number two, though he lacked the title of president. O'Neill had told the board he didn't feel any need to fill the position. Within a matter of months, Patrick began going behind O'Neill's back to the board, pushing board members to insist that O'Neill name a president and promoting Zakaria for the job. Almost every executive associated with Merrill Lynch of the time will later point of this fearing as a critical event in the O'Neill era, and not for the better. O'Neill had always been insular. He was the kind of man who liked to play golf by himself. Now he became insulate. He had been worried. Now worried. Now he became suspicious of everyone around him. Patrick and Zakaria were extremely competent executives. He replaced them with more pliable, lieutenants. He trusted no one but himself. Sorry. Although O'Neill didn't realize it, this was not the way to compete with Goldman. Goldman's executive committee members all participate in discussions about all the various business. O'Neill, by contrast, insisted that the company's executive speak only to him about their business and not discuss the business with one another. The Goldman brass insisted on knowing bad news. Merrill executives trembled at the thought of giving O'Neill bad news. Whenever Goldman's CEO had to make an important decision, He consulted with a handful of advisors to solicit their advice. O'Neill rarely asked for input when he was preparing to make a decision, and under no circumstances did he want to be changed once he had made up his mind. A few a few years after the ouster of Patrick and Zachariah grew Greg Fleming, one of the few O'Neill lieutenants who had the temerity to disagree with him, was having dinner with him, pressing him on a handful of issues. As the dinner was concluding, O'Neill said, "This is getting too painful. Stan, I don't understand what you mean by too painful. I'm just disagreeing with you," replied Fleming. "I don't think we can have dinner anymore," said O'Neill. They never did. The Merrill culture pre-O'Neill had always been fearful of risk. There was a good reason for this. When the firm got too aggressive, it often got burned. Merrill, after all, was the firm that persuaded Orange County to trade derivatives in the early 1990s, resulting in the country's 1994 bankruptcy and a huge blank age for Merrill. In 1987, during the early days of mortgage-backed securities, a Merrill Lynch mortgage trade named Howard Rubin lost 2,050 million won on one trade. That loss was big enough that Merrill stayed away from taking significant risk in the mortgage business for years. A decade later, during the long-term capital management crisis, Merrill struggled to maintain its li- li- liquidity, fearing at one point that its biggest retail money market fund might break the book, a break the buck, a potential disaster. Anytime a trade lost 15 million, recalls a former Merrill trade, it was like the Spanish Inquisition. Inquisition. You couldn't take big risk without accepting the possibility of big losses, and that was something that Merrill just couldn't stomach. Taking a lot of risk just wasn't part of its culture. O'Neill pushed hard to change that. According to former Merrill executive, he was constantly asking the various desks why they weren't taking on more risk. Sometimes when he saw the firm's bar number, he would actually get angry. It wasn't high enough, which to him meant that Merrill wasn't taking the kings of risk it should be taking. He begged his department. It's when They want to hire aggressive young Turks while getting rid of those who didn't have the risk appetite he was looking for. And he constantly compared Merrill's performance to Goldman's. You didn't want to be in Stan's office on the day Goldman reported earnings, recalls one of the former lieutenants. Everybody on Wall Street had a big mortgage desk, Merrill Lynch included. By the time O'Neill became CEO, they were all beginning to focus on underwriting collateralist debt obligation that include at least some percentage of subprime mortgage. With this new CDO market up for grabs, Merrill decided to go all in. Within just a few years, Merrill was the dominant underwriter of CDOs, taking the business from 9 CDO deals worth $2.2 billion in 2002 to 38 deals worth nearly 19 billion in 2004. It went from 50th in the ranking to first. Between 2002 and 2007, Merrill Lynch underwrote 100 CDOs, 27 more than runner-up Citigroup. Merrill's management viewed its number one ranking as proof positive it could play with the big boys, and that ranking became something to be preserved at all cost. The man who had the ultimate authority over the mortgage desk for Merrill Lynch in those days was a veteran trader named Jeff Cronhall. He had spent his career around mortgage-backed securities. While still in his 20s, he had run the mortgage desk for Leo Ranieri at Salomon Brothers. Cronhall and joined Merrill in the late 1980s, just a few years after O'Neill overseeing its trading desk until the mid-1990s when he took over its derivative business. Although he spent such of the 1990s pushing a reluctant Merrill to take more trading risk. He threw its tepid rights limits constrained its ability to make sizable profits. He also had a healthy fear of mortgage-backed securities. He had watched them get increasingly raised over the years. His essential view was the Merrill's rule should be to create a structure that allowed investors to gain to exposure to risks they want to take. But Merrill itself should never assume those risks. They are things you want to sell, not hold. He used to tell the traders who worked for him in O'Neill's push to have the firm take on more risk. Cronhall found himself in a tricky position. He had had a few run-ins with O'Neill over the years, but Pratik and Zakaria, both good friends of his, had persuaded him to stay. Once they were gone, Kronthal didn't have any protectors in the executive suite. More important, anyone around him was creating CDOs as far as they could. Kronhal's boss, Dow Kim, had all of fixed income. Stan was constantly pounding on him about why they weren't making as much in fixed income as Lehman or Goldman, says a former Merrill executive. As O'Neill pushed Kim pushed Kronhall from below. Meanwhile, Kronthal was trying to keep the CDO team under control. That was no small task either. The team was headed by Chris Ricciardi, an aggressive 34 years old trader. A decade before, while at Prudential Securities, Ricciardi had been part of a group that had first come up with the idea of bundling mortgage into a CDO. After successful stints at Prudential and then at Credit Suisse, Ricciardi and most of his team joined Merrill Lynch and July 2003, where he quickly ramped up the firm's CDO business. Kronthal and his crew of veteran traders viewed Ricciardi warily. He was dangerous, says one former Merrill trader. He didn't care about rules. If one of his managers didn't give him the answer he wanted, he sought out another manager. All he cared about was himself and his team. He was always trying to live and take his team with him. Kronhal's belief was let him go, but Dow Kim through Merrill needed then more salesmen just like him. He was exactly the kind of aggressive risk taker that O'Neill wanted at Merrill. According to someone who did business with him, Ricciardi was surprisingly mild-mannered for someone with such an outside reputation. He didn't have a lot of flash, this person says, but he was a natural leader, the kind of person who, as a college student, had put together groups that made money painting houses, and his same person says he was very smart and he could articulate a case. One investor recalls looking at an early Ricciardi deal that included credit card receivables as well as mortgage bank securities. It had a very limited default history. The investors asked what would happen to the security if the credit card default started to rise. Ricciardi had no good answer, and the investor walked away from the deal. but Ricardi still managed to maneuver the rating agencies into giving most of the deal a AAA rating. Ricardi knew exactly what he'd been hired to do. The strategy has been to be a high volume underwriter with a focus on areas that are very popular. He told a trade publication in early 2005. What was popular, of course, was, was subprime mortgage to ensure that it had a steady surge of subprime mortgage to securities and then bundle into CDOs. Merrill took a 30% stake in Ownit, a mortgage originator founded by Bill Dallas. A Merrill executive joined to owned Burned by 2006, says Dallas. Merrill was pushing him to make loans that would generate more yield for Merrill CDOs. They never told us to make bad loans. Dallas says no. They will say you need to increase your coupon, meaning make loans with higher yields. The only way to do that was to make crappier loans between the fourth quarter of 2005 and the first quarter of 2006. Ownit went from being a company whose loans were virtually all fully documented to becoming a company that was, in his words, not dog-centric. He became more of a subprime lender. In short order, Merrill would then create mortgage-backed securities out of the mortgage it bought, warehouse the new securities until they could be bundled into a CDO, and negotiate hard with the rating agencies and tinker with the CDO's structure to get most of the security level AAA. Ricardi and his team picked the firms that could manage the assets in the CDOs one they'd been created, and the inventors who bought the tranches. They had big, sophisticated inventors all over the globe lined up the buy Merrill's CDO tranche, but Ricardi was also not above pitching a smaller fry. According to the Wall Street Journal, Merrill distributed some of its riskiest CDO sleaze throughout its global network of wealthy private clients. In 2004, at New York's Harvard Club, the journal audit salesman described the merits of CDO investing to doctors, hedge fund managers, and businessmen. Merrill Rice managers, meanwhile, would hold regular meetings to try to figure out who Ricardi was selling his CDOs to and whether the buyer was truly an appropriate investor. Finally, Ricardi was in the vanguard of the practice of rebuilding the BBB mezzanine portion of the CDO into new CDOs. Thus, would BBBs be turned into AAA tranche, which were much easier to sell. Riccardi could find someone to buy any piece of shit, says a former Merrill executive. Crownhall didn't have any moral objection of the CDO business. Nobody on Wall Street did, but as an old hand at the business, he was keen to make sure that Merrill itself wasn't warehousing too many CDO tranche. For instance, he imposed a 1 billion limit on AAA tranche that could be held as an investment on Merrill's own books, largely because of Conrad's caution. By the spring of 2006, Merrill had around 5 billion or 6 billion in its total exposure to CDO, with mortgage banks tranche. Most of the exposure consists of securities Merrill was warehousing until they could be blown into CDOs. It was hardly a small number, but it was a manageable one. It didn't it put the firm at risk. In early 2006, Riccardi suddenly left Merrill. He jumped to Cohen and CO, a firm that managed many of the CDOs that Riccardi had sold at Merrill. He quickly assured the rest of the CDO staff that the firm would do whatever it takes to stay number one. He said the same to Stan O'Neill. A few months later, in April, Merrill's directors and top executives went to Pebble Beach for an off-site. During one of the working sessions, the discussion centered on Merrill Fixed Income Department. The world has changed, O'Neill told the assembled executive, according to several people who were there. Fixed income and credit, he added, were no longer cyclical in nature. There was going to be an ongoing demand for fixed income products. We need to continue our ability to take risk and manufacture products, he said. By then, Crontal was beginning to fear the mortgage market was become overheated. His bosses, starting with O'Neill, left otherwise. They want more people like Riccardi, not fewer. They want to be a mortgage originator, just like Lehman and some of the other firms had. They want to write other firms to bring in aggressive young talent. Cronhall thought the hour was getting late, and Merrill would be better served pulling back. Out of the offsite, Cronhall and his team gave a series of presentations outlining the risk and the possibilities in Merrill's various fixed income desk. In 2005, Cronhall had been Merrill's highest paid non-executive employee, with a bonus of more than 12 millions. That sum was a testament to the profits his desk were making at Merrill. To the board that day, Cromwell and his team were portrayed as the Greybirds, the seasoned hands who knew how to take a smart risk. 6 weeks later, they were all fired.